So there's actually giant fucking cables just running from country to country through the ocean.
Oh, yeah. And sometimes sharks attack them for no reason.
Oh, my God.
Welcome to the Mr. Bill podcast. I'm Anand Harsh, his manager, editor-in-chief at theunz.com, and as of this summer, grill guy. I've been grill pilled. All I care about is firing up the grill, cracking open a Narragansett Tallboy, and yelling at my neighbor over the fence about how much my lawn sucks. Originally, I was black pilled by a left-wing podcast and became a doomer obsessed with eco-accelerationist Armageddon, but now I just throw on some briquettes on the Barbie and just chill, man. Bill's guest today is a dear friend of his, Donald Guy, who's a software engineer. He produces music as DGAF and infrequently uploads videos to YouTube under the moniker DBGMODE. They know each other super well, so the conversation is all over the yard and covers some seriously interesting territory, which is just my kind of episode. Let me just take a second to thank everyone who's subscribed on Bill's Patreon. You're helping keep the show going and make Robert's head not explode from the nonstop editing he has to do in order to get 2 episodes out each week. We've had some really insane suggestions for bonus episodes, so please keep those coming because we're really leaning into the crazier ones. Head over to patreon.com/MrBillsTunes for all the info and to support this show. And remember to go to MrBillsTunes.com to sign up as a hardcore Abletuneer. It won't make you a better partner or parent, but it will make you a better producer. All right, that's it. Enjoy this episode with Donald Guy.
Hey, you're listening to the Mr. Bill podcast.
Hey, you're listening to the Mr. Bill podcast.
Hey, you are listening to the Mr. Bill podcast.
Hey, you're 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 listening to the Mr. Bill podcast. Hey, you're listening to the Mr. Bill podcast.
Hey, you're listening to the Mr. Bill podcast.
Hey, you're listening to the Mr. Bill podcast.
Hey, you're listening to the Mr. Bill podcast.
Cool, man. Well, fuck yeah. Thanks for coming on the podcast. I appreciate you taking the time to do it.
No worries. Happy to be here.
Cool. Yeah. So before we get into conversation, I just wanted to let people know how we know each other, and it's through Jan. And you guys met at MIT at the time she was studying physics and you were studying computer science.
Yeah.
And since her introducing both of us, I just feel like every conversation we have, I learn a lot. And I find that you just have really insightful opinions on a lot of shit that I haven't thought about. And that's why I wanted to get you on the podcast, because I think that you're really interesting.
I hope that you are right because, I feel like I'm not core to the material of your podcast. But I know you've had some of your other guests, but
yeah, usually it's just me talking to someone else about writing music, right? And or it's usually producers, so we always have the perspective of a producer, which is interesting. I mean, there's a lot of perspectives you can have as a producer, but at some point it's nice to talk to people who specialize in other areas as well.
Yeah, and we got crossover on that because obviously I have done some music production, but basically none by comparison to most of your guests.
Right.
A lot more other stuff.
Where should we start? I mean, let's start with programming, I guess. What are you working on at the moment, if you're allowed to talk about it?
Am I allowed to talk about it? That's a good question. So I'm a contractor, and so I do sort of work with clients, and so I don't know what I'm super allowed to talk about. I would say what I'm doing though for work is pretty standard stuff. The tool set I use is a little interesting, but the actual work itself is sort of your standard web app. The one I'm doing right now, I guess you could say, is broadly, without giving the client's identity away, is in the area of, I guess, event organizing, right? You can think of it sort of like meetup.com, although it's more specialized for a particular use case.
Right. And so what kind of things are there to think about when developing a platform like that?
So it's an interesting thing, right? We were actually on this job, we were hired by a client who already had a thing they sort of had half designed. And so we're doing sort of following their lead on that. And so you can think of it as sort of like a spec job, right? And so it's interesting to balance the interpretation of what they're asking for with sort of what we think they actually want. And it's also interesting right now with the world situation, because normally with software like this, what you would want to do is get in front of users sooner rather than later. There's not usually a big like unveiling, right? We can talk about there's actually like a whole thing about software development methodologies and like approaches. And I would say what my company leans toward is what people would sort of call agile development. But really, mostly what that usually is about is like getting stuff in front of users and getting feedback and making sure stuff works in reality. But like, as I said, it's sort of event organizing, and like we're in the middle of the pandemic and everything's shut down. So there's like,
right.
no.
Yeah, it's almost like, it would almost seem like there's no point in making it at this moment.
It does seem a little bit like that, but money's got to flow. And yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely a lot of stuff you think about, right? But it also depends sort of how much of the job you're going through, right? In software development, people sort of talk about front end and back end, and like certainly where I work, we do all of the above, but this job is sort of back end, middle, like. There's an app that already exists that already has like a website, and then we're like adding new functionality that it like talks to behind the scenes to be able to do new stuff. So that I think puts the kibosh on some of the more interesting questions about like actual user interaction. Although I really always try for these types of things to still like think about it anyway, right? Like your user is no longer the person using the website, but your user is definitely like the people working at the company who like have to like write code that talks to this other code. And so you want to make sure the way you design, the way you talk to it is good, right?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know a whole lot about programming, but what it seems like to me is this kind of the levels of it. You have like the conceptual level, like you think about an idea and you're like, oh, that would be cool to make. And then it almost seems like a lot of the process I see programmers go through is first step usually, and I don't know if this is the case when you're doing stuff on the level that you're doing it, but, for people who are just sort of doing independent DIY kind of hacky code projects and whatnot, it seems like the first step is just to go to GitHub and see if libraries already exist, like if somebody's already solved the problem for you. And then it seems like just a lot of sleuthing, right? Like you kind of get a library, you put it in some sort of code reading program, and then you sort of just try to get information back from the code that's already there by just like sending print messages to like an inspector or whatever.
It definitely can be like that. There are definitely sort of different styles, right? And like you can make the analogy to music production that what you're saying is, if you think about it, if you're going to make a song and you're like going off of some sample libraries, right? You're like scrolling through sample libraries and being like, oh, that kick sounds good. Like this, like I think it would go well with this hi-hat. Or if I put this effect on that, like it would go together. And that's sort of the type of coding you're talking about. And you can definitely go the other way, right? And think of it in the analogy to like sound design, right? You can start with thinking about sort of the layout of how you, so like every problem, right? You're sort of making a mental map of the problem space, and you're sort of thinking about like, oh, I need to keep track of these things and the relationships between these things. And then you sort of can start defining it out in terms of the relationships between things and how you would want to store them, and like what ways you need to be able to grab the data, what ways you need to be able to like search the data, what ways you need to be able to compare things. And you can sort of pull that out into, schema design is sort of the word sometimes used in software engineering, but sort of like a data design. And you think about what that's going to do. And that can certainly inform like what technologies you choose to use, much like if you think there's some sound you want, you have some experience with some plugin, like if you're doing more sound design, right, that you like pull up Serum or you pull up the operator in Ableton, and like those are similar, for example, which is sort of maybe why I thought of them together. But like they're a little bit different depending what you have experience with, depending what exactly you're trying to go for. I guess maybe like operator and Serum are a better. Did I say operator before? I thought I said wavetable. Anyway, but yeah. But yeah, you sort of go for that job. And so yeah, I people have a very different approaches to this, right? And I definitely lean more on that end. I definitely am trying to create, like, definitely I don't want to be wasteful, right? If I can think of a tool available, and I'm not saying I'm not going to go look on GitHub, but like, I definitely, sort of the first job often with a job like this is like being like, is the thing I'm doing new? Is it like unique and enough that I want to put in the effort to make it from scratch? Or is it something that is super common that I definitely know I can go grab code for, that code's going to be good, that like it's going to be usable, that I'm not going to have to spend as much time figuring out how to use that code as it would take me to write it myself, in which case, it takes a long time to write it, but like you wrote it. So if you did a good job, you should understand how it works.
Right. The other thing too, I guess, is if you want to like make the analogy between music production and coding again, it's almost like with coding, with music production, there's like using samples to make a track. There's always a point in doing that, even if another track that sounds like it exists, because you create another track, like another piece of music that is not 100% similar to this other thing, even though it might serve the same function for one or two people listening to it as it's hitting the same part of their brain, artistic, or whatever, like juicing the same receptors.
It
with
does,
a similar
but
type of music. But with programming, it's like your shit either just works or it does not work. And
I mean, things can work well and they can work poorly. Like that definitely is the case with software, and it can definitely depends on whether a project for something like a consultant, right? But even more so for a company that you're running, right? There's software that you have to. One thing about a song, right? I guess this isn't quite true, and when we live in the world of remixes and stuff, but like for the most part, a song, you work on it once and it's done. Something you often have to think about in software engineering, and I guess if we're playing the analogy we have been going for, this is like if you think about people sampling your song in the future, but that's a little bit weird. But like when you're building software and it's going to have a long life cycle, you do have to really worry about like laying the groundwork for things you think you might need in the future, right? And so I guess when you're making a track and you're not sure quite where it's going yet, you can think of it like that. But like it's open-ended. Like there's not usually a done point. And to be fair, I know people feel that way about music too, but eventually like you're gonna master it out and it's gonna be done unless you revisit it later. Like software, and I guess that sort of happens with a project-based thing with a consultant, but especially when you work at a company, it's like you never know whether what you just finished is good for like it has to complete the task you're working on, but like you don't know if it's good for years, or whether you're going to be back like adding stuff like in a couple days, couple weeks, like
right. I have a question. So there's this huge, or not a huge argument, I guess it's somewhat of a big argument, and it specifically happens a lot in the music community, the whole like Mac versus Windows thing. There's so many producers who are like, oh man, you have to, like, I would never use a Windows like laptop live, right? I would only ever trust a Mac laptop live or whatever. And for me, I mean, I've used Windows for forever, and I've used a Windows laptop at fucking, I don't know, at hundreds of shows and never had a problem. And the opposite, I cannot say is true. I've had plenty of issues using a Mac laptop live, actually. But I had the question that I have, and I before I go further with the actual question, want to mention that like I don't think one is better than the other, right? Yeah. Like I think Windows is great. I think Mac is great. Like I think all of these fucking things are like way beyond my level of comprehension to create, and I'm glad they all exist. But if there was only one operating system, like let's say no other operating system existed ever except for Mac OS X, do you think it would be as good as it is, or do you think like having this competitor Windows in the same field of trying to sell a thing or whatever has like forced Apple to make a better product?
Yeah, I mean, I think marketing and competition are definitely real things. I think that you obviously like it is honed. You have the whole sort of Darwinian survival of the fittest thing. One of the things that's weird though about this, and especially where we've sort of gotten to with the operating system market, right, is that like Mac OS, you can make the case, and Linux being part of the same family, like derived from a long tradition that like some of it is literally the same code that like got written back in like the 60s and like has, it's probably been rewritten, but like stuff's been copied over, it's been carried through. Whereas Windows sort of, I guess there was DOS and they bought that and that was a little bit different, but like it's in some ways a younger operating system. And it's interesting how much they've been made to, for good reason, because people, use both. Ideas that succeed in one get transferred to the other, like we're sort of talking about, but like they're made to be very similar on the surface, and they obviously have a lot of commonality, but like the deeper you dig in some ways, the more different they are, at least until you get to a certain point. And then I guess they sort of get the same again because you have to still talk to the same computers. But
right, like you're still accessing the same similar hardware, right? Like once you get down to the very, very low level stuff, it's like you're still accessing an Intel chipset and whatnot.
But it's part of that was like, for years of my life, right? And it's interesting how far we've come. Like Windows was so clearly the default for everything, right? And a part of that was about the hardware, right? Is nobody wanted and they were making, you know, a CDR drive, say, but like, music actually has been less taken by this because MIDI was standardized so early on. But if you think of other stuff, you might buy some like a game controller, although that's maybe not a great example either. But like for a long time, it was like people would only write this stuff to make Windows be able to talk to their hardware. Nobody would bother to do it more than once. And so like Windows really did take its sort of monopoly for granted for a long time, and it only really lost that when people started caring more about like phones than they cared about what was running on their computer.
Right. So I for the longest time I just assumed without really knowing that Windows was probably the better system for coding on it. And I guess I just thought that because it kind of looks more hacky, and you hear this like idea espoused all the time that it's like a more customizable system. And that's the thing people always say with Windows, right? It's like, oh, it's more customizable. Mac just kind of has all these built-in shit that works, but like Windows, you can customize it more. But after hanging around with you and Jan and other programmers introduced to me basically through you or Jan, I've kind of realized, or you pretty much realized that you all use Mac. And
yeah,
I mean, did you want to go into the reasons for that? Also, I want to talk about how you worked at Microsoft and they made you use a Mac.
I don't know if they made me, but they certainly assumed I was going to, and they were right about that.
That's insane. Yeah, like, I mean, just to like not skim over that point, I want to like reiterate that you worked at Microsoft, and when you worked there, you used a Mac as your work computer.
But it's also worth pointing out, like, I appreciate the irony as well, although they did actually make me use like this weird stripped down version of Windows when I had to like access sort of internal stuff, and it was super frustrating, but not because it was Windows, because it was like super stripped down to try to be secure. But it's also worth saying that like the software I was working on for Microsoft was software that like was originally written at Google and then like got open sourced, and then like Microsoft was picking it up and trying to commercialize it, while Amazon did the same thing and Google did the same thing with the thing that they originally made. Although like my boss's boss, I want to say, by the time I left, because he got a promotion in there, was one of the 3 dudes who originally wrote the software at Google before he moved to Microsoft. So that's part of that. Like, it was written at Google, where obviously it was going to be targeted at Linux. And so, I could have worked, you can work with it from Windows, but like, it's not actually designed for it. But talking about the bigger question, right? Like, it actually has a lot less, I think, to do with like the design of the operating system. Although that does come out when you talk about like Windows being customizable. The reason it is that way, the reason it feels that way, but also how it influences what people would say. Even a producer would say, I don't trust Windows to stay stable. And to be fair, there was that whole period, Windows 98, Windows ME, where like it crashed all the time. That's not the world we live in anymore, but it was there. And I think it's part of the same thing, whereas Windows, and this has changed in some of the newer versions of Windows, but going back historically, Windows was all very under the covers, was all very mixed together. And that actually derives kind of from being in DOS. Going back further than that, DOS was always made to be a system that was run by one person on one computer, like for a hobbyist. And Mac OS derives from older systems that were used by like a bunch of people at the same time, right? Like a university or a lab would have a big like mainframe, and people would have like terminals, and they would dial in, and they would like have an account, and they would need to like be kept separate from each other. And so that's true of the way the systems in the operating system work together as well. And that's sort of why it has the reputation of being less customizable, because like things are kept apart. Things are kept sort of in their own like corner, and like there are more rules about what can interact with each other. That's also why you got less like viruses and stuff for a long time, in addition to just fewer people using it. But like that is sort of where that comes around, and that's where that separation comes. But it also, I guess that same history sort of influences why things are the way they are in terms of who uses what. Because Windows was designed for DOS was designed for the hobbyist, but then by the time you got to Windows, it was designed for the office professional. It was very much, Windows was part and parcel to the IBM personal computer, like the original product that was called the personal computer, the IBM PC. And like, that was what it was designed for. It was going to sit on your desk. You were going to use it for word processing, like spreadsheets. And, later presentations later. After that, you got in more of the, maybe even like web development type stuff, making websites, making music, those types of applications. But because it was designed for like that audience that you were sending it out to the general public, they made the business decision, right, to make the tools that you used to like write code and like make new programs and stuff were all things that you had to like buy from Microsoft separately. You had to like buy into the system and like be a Windows developer and like pay them for the licensing privilege to do that. Whereas because macOS derives from an older tradition of Unix-like operating systems that were this like one big system that you had for, research departments at universities, some like data processing departments, R&D departments at big corporations, it was just assumed everyone who was going to use those systems was going to be constantly like writing new software, making new tools for themselves, little specialized things. And so it kind of, the culture derived early on that it was all sort of free, all sort of included. Not even necessarily free, but it was all included. Like if you bought one of the commercial Unixes, like it came with the whole tool chain to write new programs. Whereas Windows, the person who bought Windows was buying it to use it. If they wanted to make stuff for it, they had to go back and pay more money for the tools to do that. And it's actually, the culture clash is interesting, and it goes back a little bit further. There's like a famous-ish story in early computer history. There was a group of people in like roughly the Stanford area that was a group of people called the Homebrew Computer Club. And famously, that's where Steve Wozniak premiered the like Apple I, and it like sort of kicked off that thing. But there was a thing earlier in there where it used to be the culture of those like hobbyist clubs that like people just passed around programs. Like they would bring in like their, paper tape or their magnetic tape, and like people would just like make people copies and give them stuff. And like Bill Gates famously wrote this like scathing letter like against software piracy, and everyone was like, what are you talking about? Like, software is free. That's just how software works. Like, but then he became the world's richest man for at least a long time. But
so I wanted to go back to one of the things you were talking about, how you were saying some of the code in Linux or Mac OS has been like ported forward since like the 60s. And I want to relate this back to music writing a little bit. So there's some things in music production, right, that are literally the product of having a slow computer, and one of those things is resampling. So the idea is that back in the day you couldn't have more than a couple of MIDI tracks running at the same time. It was just too processor intensive for the computers at the time, because we were producing on laptops that had like 200 megabytes of RAM or whatever. So
not that. That's a lot.
Well, not when you're trying to run Ableton.
Oh, I know, but I think you go back to like the original Logic, right? Like notation Logic went back like to the Atari, and that was like like kilobyte system.
Right, and all it could play is like fucking probably 8-bit chiptune stuff. But anyway, where was I? Oh yeah, so because we couldn't run more than a few MIDI tracks at a time, what we would do is make one layer, and then we'd resample it to audio, and then put that in samplers and like mess with it more, right? And the result is like resampling, which spawned tons of shit in electronic music. Like, I mean, it didn't really spawn like sampling in the way that like they do it in hip hop, but it definitely spawned sampling and using resampling and samplers in the way that we do it in, say, like Neuro, like the shit that Noisia does, or the shit that like you hear in a lot of dubstep these days, like that really growly, fucked up, like resampled bass stuff. A lot of that came from this, right? So I wanted to ask if there's anything like that exists in computer science, and I think you've already like partially answered it by saying that there's code that has just been ported forward since the 60s. But also I asked Jan this question, and she was the one who was like, I just thought of it when we were like cooking dinner one night and asked her, and she was like, you should ask Donald this. But her answer was that a lot of old software, because it had to be optimized for shittier computers, now runs like so much better on current systems. So I guess wanted to get your thoughts on that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, there's a little bit of that. It's sort of this thing, right? Like the analogy to resampling is interesting because you can think of that as analogous sort of, if you're thinking like you have the MIDI information, you can think of that like source code for a program, and like a resampled thing is like a compiled version of a program, and like the version that runs. And like for the most part, unlike, this is something that actually kind of, when I first got introduced to resampling, it kind of like surprised me that people, and I understand why it's a good idea to make the constraints on yourself, but like, you resample the thing, you like throw away the MIDI track that you were resampling a lot of the time. I mean, sometimes you save another session, don't look at it again, but like people, like definitely coming as a software engineer, when I got into music, like I have this temptation to keep everything around, and then it maybe gets too crowded. But like, so that's the thing. Like software, depending what ecosystem it came from, people tend to keep the source code around somewhere. You definitely do have these interesting cases of like programs that got written a long time ago that people still depend on. Usually not big ones, but like I remember when Jan and I were at MIT, I was involved in this club there that's like, it's actually MIT's computer club, which seems like a crazy thing to exist, but it's because it like goes back to the late 60s when like even at a place like MIT, it was a super niche interest, and it just sort of has existed the whole time. And because of that, it's called the Student Information Processing Board, because back in the 60s, people called computer science information processing. That was like the whole field. But anyway, getting back on the topic, I was doing, they arranged through that. We did like a tour of like one of the big data centers that runs the whole like network at MIT. And they were like, we were walking around and they're like, oh, how when you like go to connect a computer to the MIT like network, you get like this like website and you have to like go through and register your computer, and then it like whitelisted and it lets you through. And the guy pointed to this server and he's like, yeah, the code, it's on there. We don't have the source code. Like it's just been running for a long time, and like nobody touches it because like if we still need it, and like nobody can make it again. So it's like this thing. And you do occasionally have, it's like a real niche thing because it doesn't happen that often, but you do have some communities that like do take these like binaries and like try to like modify them after the fact. And that sort of, and some of that stuff ends up pretty weird in the same way that like, you get the weird growly noises of modern neurofunk and some of the weirder genres. It's just not that common, but you do see other weird stuff. One of the ways you get around this though is that like when old computers go out of fashion, rather than like throwing all that code away, what people tend to do is they tend to make emulators, right? In the same way that you have all of these like VSTs that emulate older hardware, people just have emulators that emulate older computers that you run on newer computers. And because of the way those work, you can actually, to some degree, like it's not super, super common, but it definitely happens that you can take, and to be fair, part of it is because stuff's been fairly standardized now for a good 40, 30 years anyway, but more like 40. But you would have like, you can run the emulator for the super, super old computer inside the emulator for the old computer, and then like run that on a modern computer. And then that way people just keep using old mainframe programs. I had a guy tell me one time that like, if you remember Y2K and everybody freaking out and like for good reason, and nothing really happened because people did so much work to avoid it. But where nobody did that work is these super, super old programs that were still running inside emulators. So there were actually a bunch of like IBM System 360 mainframe programs that had super bad Y2K problems. And they like didn't know what to do about it because they didn't have the code anymore. Right. They were just running like these old things. But yeah, there is some, to get to Jan's point, there is some of the stuff, like if you run old DOS games in an emulator, they run super fast. Like they were designed to like actually use basically what you can think of as like the BPM of the CPU, of the actual like clock frequency that like was how fast a computer processed like each step of the program. So they like blaze through it. So if you try to play some of these games, like, you push up and your character just like shoots off the screen and is fucking gone because they were designed to work on a slower computer. And that's why you also, I don't know if do you ever have a computer that had a turbo button?
No, I don't think
so. There was a period in like the late 90s where because this was a big problem already, they'd like made newer computers that could go faster, but like programs were written to run on slower computers. And so the way they solved that problem for a while, when it was only a factor of 4 to 10, like, is that they just shipped the computer still running slow. They still shipped it running like an old computer, but it had a button on it that was labeled turbo and like had a light that lit up when you pressed it, and you pushed the turbo button, your computer like went way faster, and so you toggled it back off.
Why don't they just have that on by default because of the fans? Or
well, no, I mean they didn't back then because there were still plenty of programs you were using that were assuming the computer worked at the slow speed, and so running it at the fast speed broke the programs.
Oh, right, gotcha. I wanted to ask about, like we're talking about sort of a lot of computer history at the moment, but I wanted to ask about like maybe your opinions, because usually to get a good idea of the future, having a good idea of history is a good starting point. Like where you think, like I guess just the future of technology is going in general. Like, do you think the interfaces that we have now, like the whole screen and keyboard and mouse and shit, like that kind of setup, do you think that that's going to be the norm for a long time going forward, or do you think maybe stuff's going to get moved into AR and VR and stuff like that, or what do you think is going to happen?
I mean, I think the answer is both, which is the sort of unsatisfying answer. But like to make the analogy to music, right? Like obviously there's all of the crazy new electronic music, and even as that gets more popular, like people are still making like jazz and even like classical, right? And if you look at any general electronic song, like to be fair, there's plenty that don't, but you like generally still hew to certain patterns that people are comfortable with, of, you know, a kick snare, like hi-hat type drum setup, and like a bass line and some melodic thing that stays in the same category. And I think in that analogy, right, like people are super used to like the screen mouse thing. And it's funny when you see some of it crossing over now. We're getting to that point. I'm actually not really into like VR stuff, so I'm not the best person talking about it, but I do occasionally at the edge see the thing, right, where someone's like, oh, I made this like sweet thing in VR where like you can you know, put like programs anywhere, you can draw shit everywhere, and they're like, oh, but then I like put a mouse in it because like you needed one to do stuff. Like,
well, a lot of that probably is contingent on our biology, right? Like the reason we like certain kinds of music, and I've talked about this on the podcast a lot, we like 4/4 stuff in my opinion because we walk, and walking is a 2-step system. So, you know, it just makes sense that we would find 4/4 or 2/2 or 2/4 or whatever as feeling familiar. And then in terms of why we like a lot of the sound stuff, like sound design and whatnot that we like, is just because our hearing is biologically sort of truncated at 20 hertz and 20 kilohertz. So it's kind of the same sort of thing, right? It's like we have eyes, we have arms, like we kind of need to make the whatever interface exists somewhat related to that, unless you can like really hook into the brain and get impulses straight from that.
That'll be the big game changer if it happens. And I'm not particularly optimistic it's going to be in our lifetime, especially with stuff kind of as fucked up as it is. But like, yeah, if you ever crack like hooking into people's brains, like you can do crazy stuff, except like people just don't even think the same. This is one that always gets me. Like I have, it's not, you know, like this is a self-diagnosis, but there's a thing you may see on the internet. People talk about a condition that has come to be recently called aphantasia, which is basically
to talk about this.
Lack of like visual imagination. And like, that's my life. I don't really understand what visual imagination is. I like have to put a big asterisk on that because like I certainly have some capacity for spatial reasoning. I have some capacity for like thinking about how objects look if I've seen them before, but like I definitely cannot picture stuff at all. Like,
so for instance, if I shut my eyes and try to picture like a beach, right? Like I can do that. You don't have the ability to do
like that doesn't make sense to me. And it's funny because you can go on Reddit and like go to r/aphantasia, and there's a community there, and you'll like there's only a few thread types, and a lot of people are people being distraught, being like, I didn't realize people could do this. Like, holy shit. Like, I feel so broken and like left behind. And I appreciate that feeling. But no, I was a weird kid that I feel like even in late high school and definitely by early college, I would just be like, go up to people and be like, hey, when you think, like, what is that like? Like, what do you experience? Like, how does that go for you? And I've gotten like wildly different answers. Like I have my like thing where I can say I can't visualize. And I would say that the way I do stuff in my brain, if I want to phrase it that way, is very like word based, very narrative based, very auditory, but like also I can't really like encode instrumental sounds as well as I can encode speech or words. But like I've talked to other people who like obviously they can, well, not obviously because some people can't, but like can do the internal monologue thing, but like that they always think in pictures, like even if they're thinking about something very verbal, if they're thinking about like the Gettysburg Address, they're like, which I don't know why I pulled that, but like rather than thinking through the words, they like are going through like a series of images that they can like kind of drag back to, 7 years ago.
Well, that's apparently the way that you do like crazy memory stuff. I've seen like videos of people online or
that's one of the ones that set me off. I took like AP Psych in high school, and they were talking about like method of loci and like peg word systems, and they're they had the memory palace thing. They had the like peg word system. They tried it.
We should talk about the memory palace because like that's an interesting thing, and I don't think a lot of people will have heard of.
Yeah,
what that is.
It's also called. So I feel like memory palace got popular as a phrase after it was on the BBC Sherlock, the Stephen Moffat one, because like they had him do it. But yeah, it is, I think, more traditionally amongst the types of nerds who would talk about it, referred to as the method of loci, because it's like you walk around your memory in your head.
Yeah.
Which
so the idea is that like let's say you came up to me and gave me a $1 bill, and I looked at the serial number of it and gave it back to you, and then tried to recite it to you 10 minutes later. That I would have some sort of environmental thing like attached to that in my brain, where like the number 0 might be a cat, and I don't know, the number 2 might be a dog, or the number 11 might be a door because it looks like a doorway or something. And I just associate certain things in my brain with that, and then when I want to recite the number to you, I just sort of walk my way back through that environment in my brain, basically reciting the objects and seeing representational number back to you as I walk through it.
It's interesting because you're like hybridizing the two things I mentioned. Like that to me, like you're definitely saying you're walking through a location. So like it is still valid to talk about memory palace thing, but like that is that like mnemonic assignment, like that sort of intentional, synesthesia sort of almost, but I guess more concept to concept, is much more like what people talk about as a peg word system for memory trick. And that also doesn't make any sense to me, for the record, but I totally believe it's a real thing. To me, a method of loci...
I cannot do that either, but yeah, it makes sense, I think, as like a way to remember shit.
But to me, a method of loci, like it and the palace metaphor, sorry, that was pretty plosive. But I'm looking at this waveform going into Ableton, and so it's easy to get distracted by that. Speaking of visual things, but to me, a memory palace is much more like people take memories and like put them in a room of a mental house, and then like they can go look for stuff. They can be like, oh, I know that I have that. I'll like go and I know where I put it in my head, and I'll like walk through that mental space and like go find it. And like that doesn't make any sense to me either, but it like at least conceptually makes sense to me. Because I can't even visualize stuff. Like I really have trouble with that. But yeah, as I asked people this question, I had one dude, I don't know if he was just fucking with me, but he was very insistent that like when he thought it was like a menu system, that he had like menus and sub-menus in his head that he like went through. And it was
it seems like definitely not the way that he, like, because to say something like that, I mean, maybe he did, and maybe that's a very rare case, right? But in general, like we all have, thousands and however many thousands of years of biology behind us, which has trained our memory in certain ways, right? Like up until recently, we didn't have like houses and shit. We lived in caves and whatnot. So it's like a lot of the spatial awareness and all of that kind of crap just comes from that, right? Like it comes from like the, us needing to survive for 100,000 years in the wild. So we developed all of these systems.
It does. And you
definitely
can say...
menus, I don't think like come into that.
Oh, so. But like people are definitely like, I forget whether I ever started saying this before, or whether I just was thinking it, but like, there are things that we're conditioned for, like when you're talking about musical patterns and like mainstays of motifs and like forms, like some of that is biological. I don't think you're off talking about walking pace. I don't think you're off talking about certainly frequency range, but like, I think a lot of it is socially conditioned. A lot of it is learned patterns. Like, and as the world globalizes, it's harder sometimes to pull that out. But like, if you talk about different musical traditions, different scales, different tonalities, like I think the same thing is true of potentially people's experience of consciousness. And I don't really know that, but like, it doesn't seem crazy to me that somebody like there is the question, right? If it's somebody who grew up like before computers were super normal and they were like not just like menus and submenus like weren't a thing. I don't know where they would even pull the referent for their brain to work that way. But like if you start like, you know, but I don't know, to be fair, brains change a lot over your lifespan, like just on a straight like neurology standpoint, certainly in adolescence and then later when you're around like 25. Although by the time you're 25, it's mostly like culling, like most of the connections are going away, not being created anymore. But
also aren't menus and submenus kind of just like an abstraction of us trying to like figure out how to compartmentalize lists and items and shit into a way that would make sense for an interface like a computer anyway? Like it doesn't even seem efficient to like,
it doesn't, but I don't know, like I'll say that I'm on the other end. Like one of the reasons that I can be interesting to talk to, but also why some people can find me annoying, is that like I don't do a very good job of indexing my own like memory. Like I have, if you ask me questions about like, you know, what my favorite, a time that I did a favorite thing, like an early childhood memory, like I can't answer those questions, but like definitely when I talk, when I see things, it's very easy for shit to like spring to mind that I didn't even know was like in my head, which is part of why I like playing like trivia games. But like, I think that that's a weird thing. Like I feel like my brain's not very well organized, even though there's a lot of stuff in there. But
yeah, I feel the same way. It's like I'll ingest like so many YouTube videos and podcasts, and then somebody will talk to me about something and I'll be like, I know that I've watched a YouTube video or listened to a podcast or both on this topic, and I just cannot for the life of me like remember.
The weird thing is I usually can be like, oh, that reminds me of this podcast, but like I can't do it on purpose. I can't be like it always frustrates me, like personality quiz stuff. If people are just like, oh, and they, if you ask me to make a list of my favorite things, that's always real rough for me. Like,
well, what about this? I have a question.
Okay.
What do you think the most technically impressive software currently available is?
It sort of goes back to what I was going to say, which I don't want to just railroad, but I do want to close the loop because that's also how my brain works. What I was saying with all that cognitive different stuff is it seems like it's really hard to ever talk about like interfacing directly with people's brains. Because first you'd have to be able to work with all these different styles of brains. And like maybe you can bypass that and go straight to like the neurons and like read the action potentials. But like in that same way, I think, to take it back to the question you just asked, right? Like it's hard for me to suggest there's any sort of total order of what is technically impressive, because like what people want is going to vary so much from thing to thing. Like I think they're definitely, you know, right now we're seeing a replay arguably of a thing from earlier computer history where you sort of have a split of people talking more about making machines autonomous, about people really leaning into the ML side, leaning into training models, right? Like honestly, I think Jan's like, and to be fair, she was pulling stuff from Deezer, but like the Spleeter, like real-time VST, like it's not the most impressive thing, but it's really impressive. Like it's a really interesting thing that like somebody's trained these models to be able to differentiate like drums from vocals, even though like it's also not impressive because it's a thing that like human brains can do, but we also can't separate them. So it's not the same thing, but like that's technically impressive in one way. And it's totally different from what's technically impressive about like things that are made for and by and around people. Like some of the, like it's easy to go to, I guess, like a really like impressive video game that does a really good job of simulating something and tricking people is really impressive. But I don't know. It's all areas of interest, right? Like I'm all about, that's not fair to say, but like my area of expertise has been around sort of how you coordinate computers, how you make them work together, but also is how you just keep them working well. And so like what I'm framed around, what I think is cool is not actually necessarily that impressive to other people.
Right, because it's like server-based stuff and whatnot.
Yeah, and it's like, the thing about the question is like, something can be very technically impressive in the abstract, but this is sort of the distinction that I draw between like art and engineering, certainly. Like you first kind of put science somewhere in the middle. But like when you ask like what's super technically impressive, like it's interestingly like descaling but like it's inviting a subjective judgment in a way that computer stuff often isn't. Like computer stuff is often, not that there isn't cool computer art, but computer stuff is often judged in terms of suitability for a purpose. So like how impressive a thing is kind of comes down to like how many problems it can solve and like how well it solves a problem, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like there's so many different problems that people care, and like the more you care about the problem, the more you care about the solution.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So well, I don't know that I have a good answer.
Well, what about this question? What do you think the like the biggest or most influential computing feat is in history? Probably the internet, right? I mean,
yeah, I'm biased towards saying the internet, not because it's technically impressive, right? Like there's a lot of fiddly details about how the internet works, but the more you learn about it, the more you're like, that's all it is. And also you're like, oh, it's really shocking any of that works, because it's all very, like seems very unstable and very like, it's not surprising that you can like get like, you know, a group of teenagers can go and like fuck up a bunch of websites, because like it's just kind of tied together. But again, it's not about the implementation of technology, it's about the implications, right? I think that like the internet's existence and the way that it's connects people and the way that like reorganizes society makes it well ahead of anything that like is a computer that stays in one place that one person interacts with. And like now that we're like, you know, it also opens up the thing, right, though, of letting all of the computers access all of the other computers and all of the data too, right? So I think it's cheating to say that it is that, because it's really not about the technology, but it is about how you took all the computers that were isolated and you put them all you let them all talk to each other, and also all the people talk to each other, and that is the biggest thing. And you know, it's interesting to see, to be in this situation of this like pandemic, and you compare it to I don't know a ton about epidemiological history, but like the analog people go to is the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918, and like obviously the world was very connected then enough to have like a world war.
Well,
but
they had like newspapers and maybe very early signs of television, right?
But like, not only did they not necessarily know to do this level of
radio,
social isolation,
they probably had radio, right?
They did. Like radio was definitely a big deal, but it was a very like gate kept technology, right? Part of the thing about the internet, and it kind of goes to that question about like the Unix operating systems versus the Windows operating systems, is like the internet very much like gives everybody the tools of communication and of mass market media, right? Like it's why you can have, to bring it back to music, right? Like Ableton's expensive, all the DAWs are expensive, not that you can't pirate them, but like once you've made music, you can just fucking like, and like there's plenty of art in marketing yourself, whatever, but like there's nothing that stops anyone from making music and then sharing it with people. Whereas in the area of radio, you had to get it on the radio, and there were only so many radio transponders. There were only so many ways that you could even hook up to those radio transponders and get that stuff out over the airwaves. Whereas now it's all very commodified. Everybody has the pipe. Everybody has the tool set. And in some ways, that becomes more interesting as it fades to the background. And like radio got boring compared to the 1980s scene, like the early 19-teens, right? Like I'm of the understanding that radio was still like a big deal, right? Families like gathered around the radio to like listen to a show, like, and that seems like a crazy thing to us now. I don't know. I just think a lot about like, you know, we're doing this podcast recording, and to be fair, podcasts exist at all and are a good analogy for radio or older radio, but like, it's really cool that like, you know, I'm in Colorado, where we met, but like you're in San Francisco and you've probably talked to other guests. I haven't kept track of where your guests have been, but I imagine people aren't local and you can still like keep living your life and keep having weird experiences. And I've also been really impressed with all of the like online festivals, as people have been framing it.
Right.
Like,
yeah, it's been interesting to see that even though the pandemic has like shut down a lot of stuff, it's like, yeah, a lot of shit has just transferred like almost immediately to the internet.
And I've seen some weird stuff. Like, it's interesting the way that people play with the format, and even ways that aren't like profound, right? You could have some crazier stuff. And I guess an example of that is the weekend before last. I know you were on another stream, so I don't think you got a chance to check it out. But Porter Robinson and Golden Voice and Brownies, Lemonade, whatever. A bunch of people put together the Secret Sky, which is a follow-up to the in-person Second Sky Festival last year. And like mostly that was normal stream, but they had this like online environment where you could go and you were like a little line and you like flew around and you could change colors and you could jump and you could mouse over people and like it would tell you where they were from. And I say people, but I mean little lines. And like I was talking to a friend of mine about it and she was saying that like part of the thing that was really weird and cool about it was that it was this environment where you could like sort of interact with people, but you couldn't have negative interactions. Like you couldn't talk and you couldn't, like, they could be neutral. You could maybe find it boring, but some people found it really fascinating. And it was just like, you were just together. You just like had this sense of togetherness and like gathering, and it was just like weird art thing. And that was actually not the point I was making, but I thought that was cool. But I also thought it was cool on the Digital Mirage festival that Proximity and Brownies Lemonade put on earlier. I want to say it was like Chet Porter did this set where he just like sat at his computer and had like the screen pointed like over his shoulder, and he just like sat there and chilled at his desk. I mean, to be fair, you stream on like Twitch all the time, and so it's not that different than that, but like doing it as this presented set that was like over the shoulder and him like typing stuff occasionally in messages. And like to be fair, a lot of these online festivals, because of the technological limitations, I don't know if people realize a lot of these sets are still pre-recorded. And so like, you know, better that like when you have like these streams and people like get in the chat and it can be really interactive. I've sort of lost my train of thought, if I'm being honest. But like, I do think the necessity is the mother of invention is sort of the point I'm making. It's been interesting to go through this period in the way that it's pushed people to explore different things. And it'll be really interesting to see what sticks when and if the world goes back to quote unquote normal.
What do you think it would take to destroy the internet? Like what actions would have to happen besides like a meteor hitting the planet for the internet to actually not exist anymore?
Well, I mean, so the first answer, which is a boring but factual answer, is a sufficiently like powerful sunspot type activity, like a sufficiently like, I'm forgetting the word, but basically there could be like a coronal injection, like the sun could like shoot off a bunch of energy, and like despite the ionosphere and the shielding of the Earth's atmosphere, it could just like fry all of the electronics on the planet at the same time. Like that's definitely a thing that can happen and might at some point.
Jesus,
and we like,
is that like pretty? So if that happened, you'd assume it'd probably like kill a shitload of people too, right?
I don't know. I think it'd probably give some people cancer, but like it might like give some people some seizures, but I don't think it's gonna. And it might give some people some heart attacks, but I don't know. I think, you know, we have good meat shielding around our important electronics, like better than the power lines. Because it's like, I don't even think that like every computer would be fried, but like all of the power lines, all of the substations, all the transformers would be fried. We'd certainly have to rebuild the like global electricity infrastructure even before we got around to talking about the internet.
Yeah, that's a good question. I wonder like how long... Like where obviously we'd prioritize electricity first, but I'm curious like how long it would take to rebuild that infrastructure.
I mean, what's interesting is you would have people, there would be some people who have advantages because like people who have shortwave radios and generators, like if their masts didn't like spark out, could probably get back to talking pretty long distances pretty quick. But I don't know. I mean, the fiber would be fine, probably. Like the fiber optic cable, it has light in it. It doesn't have electrons flowing through it as photons flowing through it. So I don't think it would be as sparked out. And so the backbone of the internet might be fairly intact. One of the things, if you learn too much about the internet, and this is changing over time, but like if you want to like see something weird, I know you're like on a computer right now, but I don't know if we want to bring that element into it. But if you open a browser and you go to like if you Google like internet cable map or undersea cable map,
all right, I'm gonna like. Internet cable map. All right, and then go Google Images.
So yeah, submarine cable map. No, submarinecablemap.com.
Okay, let me go check that out. Submarinecablemap.com.
So you see these lines, right? Is it loaded for you?
Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of lines.
Yeah. Well, you're seeing a lot, but you're seeing not that many. And those are all of the like transcontinental like internet connections and like phone connections that exist.
Yeah.
Like
so there's actually giant fucking cables just running from country to country through the ocean.
Oh, yeah. And sometimes sharks attack them for no reason.
Dude, I had no idea this is how this happened. I mean, I assumed it was like some connection.
I mean, there's definitely also satellites, right? And like Elon Musk is out there doing his Starlink thing, but like most of it's still these cables. And like definitely every so often, like one of them, a big one will like get cut, like usually closer to shore. And so it's fortunately therefore easier to repair, but like it'll really fuck stuff up. And so like one of the things about the internet is it's very widely meshed, but it has a decent number of bottlenecks. Like there's this concept in the internet, in BGP and gateway protocol stuff, that there's a concept of a tier 1 provider. Now that I've made you go on the internet, like pull up Wikipedia and look at like, let me see if I can actually find the title of the page, but like tier 1 network. Yeah, I think that'll do it. Like, and you scroll down, there are, how many are there on this list? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. So there are 16 companies that like what the definition of a tier 1 network is basically that they can get to any point, they can route traffic to any point on the internet without having to pay another company to do it.
Okay, so the companies here, just so people are aware, it's like AT&T, CenturyLink, Telecom, Sprint, shit like that.
Yeah, and of course you see now that all these have these like parentheses like owned by this like private equity group, a lot of them. But and like, you know, Sprint owned by SoftBank, which is like largely like the Saudi royal family and like some people in Malaysia. Like the financial network that overlays the like telecom network is like a really interesting subject in and of itself. Right. But like it is interesting that like the point is just that this list is short. And to be fair, it's gotten rather a bit longer in recent years. But like these are the companies that everybody else has to pay to talk to other parts of the internet. And the way that they talk to each other, if you see this column that says AS number, AS stands for autonomous system. And it's basically at the top level, like when networks like are deciding how to talk to each other, those are the numbers they're talking about. And they go into these big route tables that like are defined not by a technical concern, but by a business concern about like who's agreed to pay who, how much to transmit, how much bandwidth. And so like if you can get in and blank one of those tables, as occasionally has happened by accident, like famously, I keep saying famously, but like Google Cloud, if you compare Google Cloud to like AWS, Google Cloud has had a bad track record a couple times of blanking their own internal BGP tables and making it so all of their own data centers can't talk to each other accidentally. And then like all the websites on the Google Cloud go down, and it's great. And it's fun to watch from the outside if you don't work for a company that uses Google Cloud. But yeah, shit like that. Like there are definitely a bunch of weak points on the internet. Now the question is also, there's a difference between taking down the internet and like taking down the internet in a way that it can't be easily put back up, right? Mm-hmm. But like taking down the internet for a while is not actually that hard a problem.
Weird. Crazy.
But there's a limited number of people who have access to the things you would need to do it. And like, if they're doing their jobs right, those things are not themselves accessible from the internet. You have to like physically be in a place, or at least on like a back channel network, to be able to control some of those things.
Right. Cool. Well, I wanted to finish the podcast on a question that we decided we'd talk about on the podcast that you texted me about the other day. And that is music making more like making coffee, brewing beer, or writing code? And it's funny that you asked that, because at the time you asked it, which was about a week ago, I just didn't know a lot about brewing beer. But since then, I've actually learnt a lot about brewing beer. And in fact, I'm about to buy a brewing setup, I think. So,
yeah. And I'm wondering now whether you like, it might be interesting, given that I don't know how much longer you want to spend on this recording, to jettison having the argument whether it's more like writing code and just talk about the beer versus coffee side. Because I think there are things that are
interested to know. I mean, making music, I think is in, I don't know a lot about writing code, but there is some like systematic processes to it. And there is some like trying to figure out problems side to it.
Yeah. I mean, I think you can easily say, right, that if you compare like using a DAW to make electronic music versus like writing code, mechanically, they're obviously much more similar than brewing beer or making coffee, right? Like a person's sitting at a desk with a computer, pushing buttons, typing stuff, like maybe using another peripheral, but like obviously at that level there. But yeah, through the thought processes, like you say, to me, the reason I'm less inclined to say code wins out in this argument is because like software, as we said before, like it has to have a purpose. Well, it doesn't have to. Again, there is software art, and that's a whole separate subject. But like the software I ever write, right? Like you're definitely have a very specific goal you're trying to achieve, and like not that people never write songs that way, but they just don't normally, right? Like, and I think
I think you're wrong there because there is a lot of people. In fact, I would say maybe like 50% of producers I know, when the first thing they think, it seems like when they sit down to write music, is how can I make a song that A, will get a lot of plays on the internet, and B, when I play it at a show, will make people dance very hard, right? So there's two like very, very, very tangible goals there. It's but like, they're not just thinking like I'm going to sit down and just fuck around and whatever comes out.
No, I understand that, and that's a fair distinction to make. But I'm saying it's not like. So like one of the problems I have engaging with music is that like I want to idealize it as this like to me, I always think of music as like in some ways an encoding of emotion. It's like there's a part of me that like when I try to produce music and I'm not going to be able to do this, and I don't know that there are many people who can, like I want to be able to encode some particular emotional idea sonically, and like that is too hard to do, at least for me. And so maybe it's like having tried and failed, or not even really tried very hard, but having wanted to do that and feeling like I can't do it, that makes me less inclined to compare it to like when you write software, you have like a task, and the task isn't subjective. Usually, it usually has very specific. And now, to be fair, I guess how much people are dancing is also not especially subjective, but it requires them to go through a subjective judgment in order for them to have that response.
Right. It's almost like with code, you have like this like very exact like litmus test as to whether or not you did a good job or whatever.
Yeah. And to me, I think music makes a better analogy to either of these like brewed beverages, because like there's a lot of little fiddly bits that are you can quantify, you can be very precise about your process, and you can have goals, you can do this thing, but like you want people to have a good time. Like when you make a beer, when you make a coffee roast, like you want people to enjoy it. You want them to like have a vibe from it more than you want them to like have a problem solved. Although sometimes the problem is like, I'm tired, I need coffee. But
yeah, or with beer, the problem sometimes can be like, I have a problem that I don't want to engage with.
Yeah, alcohol, the cause and solution to all life's problems, as the great philosopher Homer Simpson said.
Right.
But yeah, I don't know. I'm curious in your research on beer brewing, like it's entirely possible what you know about beer brewing has now passed what I know about beer brewing, which is some. Like I was a craft beer guy. I've been on a bunch of brewery tours, but I haven't really done any home brewing myself.
Yeah. So, I mean, here's what I know. This is what I found out over the last few daes. You essentially need to make a brew, and then you need to ferment that brew. And then
you need to make wort.
Yeah. You need to make wort, which is the name for basically unfermented beer.
Yeah.
There's a lot of weird terminology. Hey, like for instance, malt. Like it's not actually malt, like malt sugar or whatever. It's just a mixture.
It's malted barley generally.
It's just crushed barley and wheat or whatever. And then there's like all these other terms like milling and stuff, which is essentially just like crushing the thing. You can do it in a mortar and pestle with a rolling pin if you want, but a lot of people have these mills to do it automatically and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, I don't know a whole lot about it. I think honestly, to me, if I had to compare it, if we're taking coding off the table and it's just brewing beer and making coffee, I would say it's more like making coffee then, because I don't think it's much like brewing beer. I think brewing beer is a lot more like baking. It's like
you've changed your answers since we talked about this via text message, though.
What's that?
I said when we texted about this, you were pro beer over coffee.
Yeah, I've changed my mind, I think. So I just think like brewing beer and baking, it's too much of a science, and it's not very. It is a little creative, but it's more or less sort of like there's only a few things that will work. Whereas with coffee, I mean, there's a few things that will work, but it seems like there's. And then again, I don't know.
There's like a lot.
Coffee is the thing I know the least about here, but like I would say, go on.
Coffee's been my like quarantine hobby, so I've learned a lot about it recently, but I still don't know that much about it. Like when you were gonna sit, when I was of the impression you were gonna go for beer, what I was gonna say about coffee is I think it has more people in the supply chain, and you can make an interesting like analogy, at least to a certain type of music production, right? That you have coffee producers who like grow coffee, And that like the analogy I was doing there for say you're making something that's a fairly sample based music, those are the people who like do sound design, like put together like sample packs and like have it go through. And then you have people who do processing on coffee, which is like when you separate it out of the plant and make it into like seeds that you're going to roast later. And I don't know quite how that fits in my metaphor here, but I think, you know, certainly if I don't think anybody does this, but if you had a sample pack, then you mastered your sample pack. I feel like that's where this is fitting in the metaphor. But it's also just like, you can think of it as processing of if you imagine that you've then received a sample pack and then you're going to like skew the sounds to make them strange and more interesting. And then you have roasting, which like is the part that is more like, beer brewing in this way, right? Like you can fuck it up, but there's still a lot of like options for things that you can, you know, do. That there's recipes you have to follow, but it's still a very subjective thing. If you read people who write essays about coffee roasting, they say, you know, you just are like experimenting constantly. You're like constantly playing with things, and you're trying to decide, and you're like tasting things, and you're trying to decide when you need to pull stuff out, and like. To me, you can either make that in the metaphor, like the actual, you know, sitting in a DAW producing thing, or you can, with the experimentation side, it's more that. Or if you think about it as finishing the product from the grown beans, then you think of it as like kind of like mastering, right? You're trying to bring out all of the flavors that were grown into the coffee and pulled out and like make them really there. And then when I was going to still pull for coffee as the final step, that coffee has the step that beer doesn't, where like somebody has to make the coffee, like somebody has to like brew it into a cup, and that's like DJing or like playing a show or like using a sound system. And that was my whole spiel that I had pre-thought about, but you did give me something to argue about. But I also thought about the other side, right? The reason beer is a better fit is because beer has styles that are like musical genres, whereas coffee has some variation, but like
if for sure does. I mean, you have light roast and dark roast and stuff like that. But if I would actually still argue that I think it's more like programming. If it was between those three things, and the reason why I think that is, you know, in this we've talked about already how you can use libraries in code and you can use sample packs in music. You know, doing a build is kind of like doing a render. You know, releasing software into the world is kind of very similar. It's a digital thing. You can also digitally release music. Like, I just think there's a lot of similarities there. But
I do think there's a lot of similarities, but I think the thought process is so different, or at least I feel like being good at programming doesn't help me be good at making music. Like, I feel like
yeah, probably not. But then, I mean, having said that, like, I know a lot of programmers who are really good at music. I think music is for sure its own thing. I know some people who are really good at music and programming. I know some people who are just great at programming and not good at music. And I know way fucking more people than I can probably count who are really good at music and not good at all at programming.
I just feel strongly, though, that the ways in which they're mechanically similar make it so, like, I sit down and open up Ableton, and the way I want to approach the problem is too much like programming in a way that's not good for making music. Like, I want to like pull up a soft instrument and I want to like fuck with all the parameters and like, but it's hard. I can't, because I have to make a subjective judgment. I have to decide when I'm done. And especially if you're not, you know, you're doing sound design, you're not making a track. Like before you moved to San Francisco, one time I went and sat in the studio when you and Musar, is that how you pronounce that?
Yeah.
Like, we're working on a thing. And it was fascinating how y'all would doing sound design and you would just like, you would fuck with some parameters, and like the thing that confuses me is that you have taste, I guess, right? That like you're like, oh, that's good. Like, we're good. We can move on. Like, we can build something interesting with that. And like, it seems so subjective, and that's why it feels to me more like someone who's roasting coffee and like pulls a sample and cups it real quick and it's like, oh, I like that, I'll keep it. Versus like programming, I always feel very much like I need to set specific sort of goals and sub goals and work against them, and they do like build back up to a thing. But like, my inability to break down writing a track that way like makes me feel like it's hard to make a song.
Right. Yeah. I understand that. Well, that's the thing. I mean, art is weird in that way. I think it was it Da Vinci who said art is never finished, only abandoned, or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can't remember who it was who I had on the podcast the other day. I think it was Matt Lang, maybe. And he had a really interesting view on that, where he was like, pretty much art is just basically all the shit that you didn't throw away. He's like, when you get to a finished song, it's literally just the process of like at each step of the way, there's 2 good ideas usually or more, and you have to use one, right? Which means you have to throw out a bunch. So it's like basically you get to the end, it's just the product of a bunch of art that didn't exist.
Yeah, but it's weird because like that does happen in software. But again, like you can have good and bad software that both objectively like solve the problem you needed to solve. And like I don't know if you can say that about, I mean, you obviously can say it about music, again, if you frame it in terms of something people enjoy, something people want to dance to. There's wildly different songs that do that. But like I always want to be more specific than that about what a goal for a music project is, and I can never quite figure it out.
Yeah, I feel that. Well, cool, man. I think that's probably like a good place to wrap up. But yeah, this is a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed it. I always enjoy going or I really enjoy hearing the tangents you go down, because it's just really interesting to me the way that you think about things.
Yeah, man, I appreciate you having me on. I'm sorry if I talked over you a couple times, it felt like, but
that's, I think, inherent when you're
especially with lag on the internet these days. It's hard to.
Yeah, that's kind of why I didn't really want to do podcasting on the internet for a long time. But obviously with the pandemic, it's made it sort of impossible not to if I want to keep the podcast going. So, yeah, but it's whatever. I mean, it's manageable.
Yeah.
Is there any places that you want people to go to check out your work?
Yeah, I mean, I assume when we tweet this will get tweeted out by you. You can just mention my Twitter, which is just my name, Donald Guy. My current Twitter bio, links to what I have a YouTube channel, which you saw a video on the other day. That's linked. My SoundCloud's there. My name, Donald Guy, also on GitHub. I don't have a ton of public code. That's very interesting, but if people want to check anything out, they can find me. Pretty much Donald Guy is one word on the internet.
Fuck yeah, man. Well, yeah, thanks again. I really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, sounds good.
Sick. All right, have a good one.
All right.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Mr. Bill podcast. These episodes are edited and uploaded twice a week by Robert Fumo of 303podpro.com. You can also support the show, get early access to episodes, and hear bonus content by going to patreon.com/Mr. Bill's Tunes and becoming a patron. Please rate and review on iTunes unless you're going to be a little shit about it. And all the links to my various platforms are at MrBillsTunes.com. Thank you.